see if we've resolved these technical difficulties. Oh, good. Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Fustel. I am currently the Master of Public Policy Program Manager here at the Public Policy Institute. And on behalf of Jacksonville University, the Institute, and our director, Rick Mullaney, I would like to welcome you all to our 6th annual Hesburgh Lecture. Director Mullaney is unable to join us this evening for a very wonderful reason. His daughter was recently admitted to the Illinois bar, so he is actually in Chicago for her swearing in this week. So he sends his regards and thanks you all. Now, over the last 6 years, the Institute has been pleased to partner with the Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville to present an annual lecture that truly exemplifies and furthers the Institute's mission and core values to educate and train a new generation of leaders and to provide a neutral, nonpartisan gathering place for the community to have civil discussions about policy issues and questions. This evening's presentation is incredibly timely, as so many of you know. We're fresh off the heels of an exciting election that still seemingly isn't over, and has really shaken up the balance of power in so many offices, both locally, at state level and federally. We're experiencing a time of political unrest and uncertainty, and that's translating to our international relationships as well. So tonight, Dr. George A. Lopez, who will be formally introduced in just a few moments, will discuss navigating those relationships with North Korea and Iran specifically. Following his presentation, we'll have a moderated discussion with JU's own political science professor, Michael Pamonte, who you might have seen recently on First Coast News during election coverage. And followed by that, we'll actually have some time for your questions. So if you have any questions about recent occurrences in North Korea or Iran, please save those for the end because we want to hear and be able to answer those. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Ann Roy, the current president of the Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville, to welcome you from the Notre Dame Club. Ann?
Just quickly, on behalf of the Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville and the university, I want to add my welcome to our 6th annual Hesburgh Lecture. These lectures bring the Notre Dame campus to alumni and friends through the Notre Dame clubs across the country by promoting intellectual dialogue with distinguished faculty members. We are thrilled to continue our partnership with JU and the Public Policy Institute. Thank you very much for hosting and setting up what is always an awesome reception. I would also like to thank our board member, Peter Fitzpatrick, for coordinating this event, and I invite him up to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. Thank you all for coming out and joining us here tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker. Dr. George A. Lopez is the current Reverend Theodore Hesburgh Chair Emeritus in Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. After growing up in Brooklyn, he earned his bachelor's degree at St. John Fisher College in Rochester, New York, and his master's and PhD degrees at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of International Relations. Dr. Lopez came to Notre Dame in 1986 as part of the founding faculty of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute. In his 30 years in Notre Dame, he won numerous teaching awards and has published extensively in both academic and popular publications. In recognition of his more than 200 radio and television interviews on topics of peace, violence, economic sanctions, and human rights, he was awarded Notre Dame's Media Legend Award. As an expert on peace building and economic sanctions, Dr. Lopez has advised international agencies and governments and has written or edited 7 books and more than 50 articles on these issues. Among other activities, he served on the United Nations panel of experts for monitoring and implementing UN sanctions on North Korea, and he served as vice president on the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. He now frequently writes for The Hill regarding issues of sanctions on Iran and North Korea. And next week, he'll be back in Washington testifying before the Lantos Commission on Human Rights on the use of sanctions to prevent mass atrocities. So we're extremely fortunate and honored to have him here with us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. George A. Lopez.
Thanks very much. The warm welcome from this great Public Policy Institute, Notre Dame, and classes that are here. I'm delighted with the mix of the audience. This is one of our most pressing foreign policy problems, and that is, can we use tools like economic sanctions to deter the prospect of major powers holding nuclear weapons or to give up ones they currently hold, and to assure we do that under conditions of diplomacy and not going to war. So it begs the question of things like, under what conditions do sanctions work and why? And that's fundamental to what we want to do tonight. But I'm also just delighted to be here because it's always great to come to Notre Dame clubs and to see former students and to meet people I haven't met before, because it's a very, very big network and a very big family. And some of you seem to systematically avoid my classes when you were there. So it's nice to catch up with you. We'll send you the quiz after. So what do I want to do tonight? I want to do a couple of things. The first is to focus on sanctions, which are often called the middle ground between just the words of diplomacy and the prospects for going to war. The second is I'd like to examine what we know, and we do know a good bit from policy studies and from more deep academic research of the conditions under which sanctions and related tools have been successful in either eliminating nuclear weapons held by a state or in stopping their development just before they get to the nuclear stage. I think we're going to look at the brief, unfortunately it has to be a very brief history, of the cases of Iran and North Korea with regard to this question. Where have sanctions worked or not worked? And then I will segment for each case what Lopez would do if I were czar. That is, I think it's useful for you to have something to come back at me at, and that is what would be my preferred policy ways of doing these things, some of which are not consistent with what has been done before or not consistent with what may be done now. But I think that makes for good, fruitful, as Elizabeth said, bipartisan discussion of these things. So let us proceed. And especially if you point it in the right direction, George. There we go. Okay. How and why have sanctions emerged as a powerful tool of Western states, but particularly the United States, in being in our foreign policy toolbox as a way to achieve certain kinds of objectives? What's the logic of sanctions that make it just beneath the use of military force as a coercive tool for states to achieve their objectives? The first and most important logic, I think, is that this is a powerful tool in a post-90s economy for denying broad-scale resources to the target that you've imposed the sanctions on. Sanctions in the old days, like in World War I and World War II and in the 1950s, were all about constraining exports and imports. But in a world of massive movement of financial capital and of people and of semi-finished products, and even in a movement of illicit trade of everything from people to uranium, sanctions can be a very powerful way of shutting down the bulk of an economy very quickly if you have coordinated agreement among imposers. So the best logic for imposing sanctions, we want to deny that target these things, and we have as a goal changing the leaderships of the target's ideas about what the benefits they're getting from pursuing the policy that we're objecting to. That is, it's essentially changing the cost-benefit ratio of a group of leaders whose country we've targeted, saying that we're going to deter you or get to change your mind about that policy by putting on such an economic squeeze that your own reasoning is it's not worth it anymore to pursue that policy. And in this case, it's about, is the development of a nuclear weapons system so positive for us that we can withstand the economic pain that would come from strongly targeted and enforced sanctions? Sanctions are also used to stigmatize a state or a cluster of actors in a state because they are doing some things that really violate international law or international norms, or we see as a direct threat to our country. So it may be that we don't think we can actually bring an economy to its knees. The best case for this right now is U.S. sanctions against Russia. We're not going to make the Russian economy collapse, but we can stigmatize and isolate and create pain in certain sectors that it's worse than a thorn in the side of the Russians and Putin's, so we can get them to maybe change their behavior in certain ways. Sanctions also have a kind of beyond the target dynamic as any coercive strategy would have, and that is, it's the focus on the target who most feels it, but the message it sends to others who might behave the same way. So particularly in the area of the use of targeted sanctions for obtaining controls on nuclear weapons, a successful case of squeezing an economy so it gives up its weapons programs sends a helpful message to others who are thinking about nuclear development but decide, I'm going to preempt the problem with the West and being strangled economically and just not go that route. It's too costly. So sanctions have these kinds of advantages, and there is a logic to them. There we go. Now, what does the world of sanctions look like since the first sanctions were imposed globally in a post-Cold War world? With the invasion by Saddam Hussein of Kuwait in August of 1990, we began in the Western world and also through regional organizations and the UN, a new application and large-scale use of this technique. In terms of the UN itself, as the largest collection of global commitment to invoking sanctions against a target, we've had 19 different regimes operate between 2000 and 2014. A number of them have accomplished their goals, such that there are 15 now in operation globally, and 5 of them are against terrorist groups in large and different ways. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban in Afghanistan, those perpetrating near genocide-like conditions in conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa. So 10 of the regimes have to do with other things like helping to improve human rights, trying to constrain nuclear weapons, or trying to bring an end to a border conflict or an internal war. It's not just the United Nations, of course. Other regional organizations like the European Union and the African Union also engage in their own sanctioning cases, often using the UN resolutions and sanctions cases as a springboard, but then going into more specialized concerns where their economy is related to the target's economy in certain ways that they can get special leverage. The European Union, our partner in the United States in many regimes, has 370 separate sanctions operative cases at this moment. Here's how quickly things move in the sanctions world. When I updated my slide here on Monday, OFAC, the United States Office of Foreign Asset Control, had 50 separate financial sanctions programs against 10,000 individuals or entities. The Treasury and U.S. language for this are Specially Designated Persons List, SPD. It's not a transmitted disease. It's really a sanctions program. In that list, you have a division between, again, a large-scale focus on terrorists and those who support terrorists, and all the others. To that 5,500 of all the others, you can now add 700 whose sanctions went into effect as individuals or entities on November 5th, because that's the new sanctions on Iranian individuals or entities. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So we're now in a position in which Treasury has entire divisions of people monitoring, imposing, evaluating, and updating sanctions, and either adding people to a list or dropping people from a list. Now, in that world of sanctions, we've come a long way. When the UN, the US, and Western Europe invoked sanctions against Saddam Hussein for his invasion of Kuwait, we essentially used general trade sanctions, and Iraq was a great target. 98% of its trade was oil. So once you lock down the trade of oil, you lock down the economy, and you can put on the squeeze. But we also learned in the Iraq case and in the Haitian case, and especially in Yugoslavia, that general trade sanctions against an entire economy may squeeze the bad leaders we're trying to influence, but they also have large-scale effect on all sorts of citizens in that country, and you can have lots of negative humanitarian effects. The concern about negative humanitarian effects was significant in making the UN, the US, UK, and others explore how could you still use large-scale, strong, coercive economic tools, but preserve, in a sense like we do in war, the integrity of the innocent. That question emerged at the same time that the global financial system was becoming more and more united, and as we learned of the relative success of the pursuit of drug illicit networks meant not only capturing the drug exports, but being able to discover where and how these people moved money, and in particular how they laundered money, and how they created shell companies for the movement of illicit money, or how they bought real estate buildings in Miami like crazy to hide drug money, which they later would sell at a different price and convert back to cash. That meant that all of a sudden came crystal clear the strongest sanction tool we would have available, targeted financial sanctions, in which we could go over individuals from shutting down their Christmas club accounts in whatever bank in the world they were held, or shutting down the financial access to American and other banks and the movement of money, and going after, through expert analysis and investigation, all these shadow companies and illicit financial networks that laundered money. And once you got all of those together and shut them down, you were focused on what? The elite core of leadership in a country that controlled all the money. And the folks in the streets didn't have to worry about whether or not you could still buy baby aspirin at the counters because we weren't controlling general trade back and forth. So when I refer to sanctions henceforth in this presentation, the world after 1998 is primarily a world of targeted financial sanctions. And it's not a surprise then that places like the United States Treasury, where the bulk of the globe wants to do its work in dollars, can be a very, very powerful and influential actor. If you wake up one morning and your bank, yourself, and your entire family has been placed on the list, and in addition to that, they revoked your passports for entering the United States, you're on a no-fly list, and various other kinds of things. So this is a powerful tool, but the world is dramatically reinforcing. You could have UN sanctions backed by US sanctions, backed by EU sanctions, and then uniquely targeted financial sanctions against a target. We've learned some things over time. From the 19 cases, from the 400 other cases that were smaller through regions and individual foreign policies, one might say, you know what the blueprint of success is. I think the first and most critical aspect of success in terms of the leaders who will impose sanctions, who will manage the sanctions, who will use it as a diplomatic tool, is to understand that they are only a tool. And they're a tool that works precisely in certain kinds of ways and will only be effective or as effective as the policy you've set up that they're meant to serve. So you better be clear about the strategic objectives you want to achieve. What do you want this coercive strangulation to result in for the behavior of the people who are targeted? What concessions do you want, and under what conditions? Unless sanctions continue to be part of a whole host then of diplomatic tools, even if they're the biggest hammer, they've got to be remembered to be only a tool. What we lost by 1994 with Iraq is sanctions became not the tool but the policy. The sanctions will stay on, they'll stay on, they'll stay on until the nuclear weapons are gone. No, they'll stay on, They'll stay on until Saddam is gone. They'll stay on until we invade and then make sure that Saddam's gone and there are no weapons. And guess what? There's still over 200 Iraqis individually under sanctions for the role they play in disrupting the regime that we helped install. And ISIS and other factional terrorist groups in Iraq. So, you can't lose your way. You can't, let's say, be so committed to the sanctions and so saying, we're waiting for the sanctions to work, then we'll tell you how it's coming out. You've got to have the sanctions deduced from and linked to the wider objectives continually stated that the other side can understand. Why? Because of reason number 2. Sanctions are meant to hurt. They are meant to enrage the target, but for a purpose, to engage the target. 80% of successful sanctions cases are successful because the sanctions have led to a systematic bargaining between imposers and targets as the primary way to achieve concessions that you want. It's not that sanctions work because at some point an economy and its leaders scream uncle and say, we give up, you're right, we'll do all these good things. And they do it, and then you take off the sanctions. That's not how it works. The way it works is much more like labor management relations when you go on strike. Sooner or later, for the good of the order of both sides, it gets to be worked out. If you have extremely punishing sanctions with only isolate the target, those sanctions sooner or later are bound to fail, no matter how much they hurt the target. Thirdly, sanctions best work when they are imposed not at the maximum level, but with clear messages to the target that today we're doing this and this and this, and it hurts, doesn't it? Then yet we reserve the right to do this, and yet to do that. And two things begin to operate as we learn more in the minds of targets. That is, you take the big hit, and you think you can withstand it, but then the second one comes and it becomes much more pronounced. And now it's not just that the third might be yet more economic pain, it's that, what? Sanctions are supposed to get them to think about the cost-benefit ratio here. Now the threat of the third level, the threat of the fourth level, creates more tension in the targeted regime that they have a decision to make. That's not a partisan statement. By the time I get to talk about maximum pressure, it happens to be the way the data of history for 27 different cases work out. Escalatory sanctions achieve their objectives in part or in full more than massive sanctions that punish and isolate. Now, how successful have sanctions been in the narrow policy area of deterring the development of weapons or denying nuclear weapons to continue and to be given up? Here's the cases that we have, such as they are. The first UN case of sanctioning a country for its development of nuclear weapons was embedded in the very resolution in which the UN sanctioned the apartheid white government of South Africa for its race relations policy. And most people don't understand this. It's right to call the sanctions imposed on Rhodesia and South Africa as two of the first sanctions cases that were pro-human rights and led to change. They played a role as one of the many tools. But embedded in the South African one was the special concern of the Security Council members with the development of a large-scale weapons system and a uranium enrichment program. The dilemma was that, as only the second major case of sanctions that the UN imposed since 1945, they didn't feel they could make it mandatory that all countries join in this isolation and punishment of South Africa. So the sanctions were voluntary. So it's primarily the UK and the United States that work very strongly behind the scenes until the early 80s to get the South African regime to give up its radioisotopes, to cut back its nuclear development program, and then they planted a seed of promises. When the apartheid regime is going, we will help the development of a major electricity system within the country that's not dependent on nuclear power. So, the first role, minor role of sanctions for controlling nuclear, South Africa. Brazil and Argentina were in a serious arms race in the 70s and 80s, and both with large-scale populations, skilled in engineering, science, and the like, and large-scale resources, had a bent towards being the first power in Latin America to hold a nuclear weapon, especially because it gave them advantages over this rival. The United States quickly decided that we'll impose technological sanctions on both groups. The Europeans joined in, and quickly it became apparent that the sanctions weren't going to work per se. And a smart group of U.S. officials went down to both capitals, met with people, and decided, we're going to pull the sanctions inside out, because what's the opposite of we're withdrawing assets from you? It's we're bestowing assets on you. So the opposite of the sticks is the carrots. The opposite of the sanctions is the incentives. So yes, the West bought its way into a nuclear-free Brazil and Argentina, which created momentum ultimately for the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which made all of South America a nuclear-free zone. India and Pakistan, the greatest example of failed sanctions, partly because the sanctions were barely slaps on the wrist, and partly because the West hadn't figured out how even the competition between Indian and Pakistani elites was playing the West, so that their competition and the fear that war would break out would be so strong that no Western state wanted to impose heavy sanctions on one or both of the countries lest you lose influence. And in that early development of sanctions logic, we hadn't figured out the principles I noted before. By late 1990s, both of these states are full-fledged nuclear powers. Sanctions didn't work. Libya had been under sanctions from the UN and Europe and the US for a good number of years in the 90s and early 2000s because of its support of terrorism. And we became increasingly concerned about what we were observing in the development by Gaddafi of a chemical and a nuclear program. He was caught red-handed with a number of shipments, and he was given a choice in 2003 about what to do about this. Since sanctions had been lifted after he turned over the terrorists responsible for the Lockerbie bombings, he was free of the sanctions from terrorism, and the economy was starting to grow, but then he was going to face even more massive sanctions. So he gave up the uranium, he gave up the gyroscopes, we took apart the centrifuges. Now most, if not all, of the uranium and those isotopes that came out of Libya are in Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee to stay forever. Successful threat of sanctions. The sanctions regime against Iraq worked. There were no nuclear weapons in Iraq. There were no biological or chemical weapons because the 10 years of imposition of a sanctions regime had actually been successful. The Iraq case tests us on how we can monitor sanctions effectively enough to know when we're already winning and not to take risks and plunge ourselves into a war of choice when the policy we used actually worked. Big case to consider as we deal with North Korea and Iran. The bargaining model played out after large-scale escalatory sanctions against Iran and led to the joint agreement that prevented the development of nuclear weapons in Iran, the closing of the Fordow nuclear reactor system, the shutting down and the destruction of the core at Tanance and various other places. We can talk about what people feel about whether it was a good deal with Iran or not, but the factual dynamic from the IAEA and others is Iran was pushed so far away from the development of nuclear weapons that the sanctions were partly responsible for that. DPRK is in process, and we better get there. Let's give the short history of how sanctions come to play in dealing with the development of sanctions in North Korea. First, this is a country that began dreaming about and envisioning a nuclear program to stand up to the South and the West since the late 1950s, with no technological or resource ability to actually do it, but they had the intention and the goal. Things get very serious under the father of the current Kim Jong-un, and he does reasonably successful in creating an underground network of trade, particularly with folks from Pakistan, in which it looks like North Korea is closer and closer in the early 2000s to the development of a bomb. And then, of course, in 2006, they do their first nuclear explosion. The world decides we've got to impose sanctions to find a way to shut this down, in particular to convince him it's not worth it. Like most good logic of sanctions, the goal there is how do we deny the North Koreans access to the material that they'll need to continue to make the program thrive? How do we deny them the technology of nuclear reactors, whether light, water, or plutonium-based? How do we find a way in which we can make sure they don't get the high-level aluminum to make centrifuges? How do we make sure they've got no highly refined ball bearings to make the system work in terms of launch mechanism, et cetera, et cetera? And from 2006 to 2011, the bulk of that is capturing and constraining so much trade, we're under the illusion that this thing is really working. Yes, they have the ability to explode 2 or 3 explosions, but they don't look like they can launch, they don't look like they can maintain it. Yeah, they're stubborn, they're bombastic, there's a lot of propaganda, but we're safe. Then comes along Sid Hecker, a wonderful physicist from the Accelerator Lab at Stanford University who had long-term contacts with North Koreans and was a trusted scientist, and comes back in December of 2010 and says to the world, here's what I saw. They proudly showed me 600 spinning centrifuges. They have the ability to reduce uranium to a very, very fine core in which they can develop the following kinds of bombs. I estimate they have 14 to maybe as many as 20. And all the experts go, wait a minute, that can't possibly be. And then the panel of experts at the UN goes on a fishing expedition to figure out how could that have been? How could we have been so wrong? And that's where we discover the linkage to the Khan Pakistani network, to the way that the Russians have been helping to build nuclear reactors secretly over the years. And all of a sudden, our sanctions policy shifts from let's keep bad goods out from going to North Korea, and let's just watch what the North Koreans are trading to make sure it's not bad things that will yield them expensive nuclear items. We shift the sanction strategy dramatically. That we've got to prevent suppliers and illicit networks of nuclear material and refined gyroscopes and guidance systems. We've got to keep that out. And we've got to be better about how we sanction the Pakistans and other countries from getting these bad supplies in. By 2015, with more and more tests, there's a recognition that this is even a stronger nuclear power than we thought it was. What are we doing wrong? Well, what we're probably doing wrong is we're permitting this criminal regime that is earning lots and lots of money through various networks, from drugs to other kinds of trafficking, from getting enough money that they can keep not only their elites happy, but they also can keep buying precision-guided systems that they can't produce themselves. So the good old rubric, follow the money, is perfect here. And from 2015 on, our goal is to shut down the ability of North Korea's leadership under a very smart capitalist, Kim Jong-un, who knows how to work the illicit financial systems better than any of his predecessors, to do so in a way in which we can constrain them financially. That becomes very successful by 2016 and 17, which then puts the Trump administration in a better position than anyone before to go after not only financial dynamics and to use that to your political advantage, but also then to directly say to China, you're the last vestige of goods and trade and normal economic exchange that's keeping these guys alive, so we need more and more of your cooperation. Sorry. So, enter President Trump. He tries 2 new approaches here: the maximum pressure strategy and Don't give me 36 nuclear experts working with their nuclear experts about how we're going to control these things. I'm going to meet one-on-one with the leader. We're going to agree to what's going to happen, complete denuclearization in a peaceful world, and then all the rest of you are going to fill in the blanks. And in the Singapore summit, it looks like, wow, this must be working. Secretary Tillerson was a little bit more skeptical of this. He believed that we needed to go back to the successful diplomacy of prior times and put all the states in the region around the table. China, Japan, South Korea, Russia, and let's work this out for even whatever top-down rubric you give, it's got to be implemented by the experts. Trump is listening much more to his conservative advisors who say this maximum pressure strategy is going to strangle them before long, will either get them to capitulate outright, scream uncle, and agree to a process of denuclearization quickly, or maybe we could just do selective bombing to reinforce the sanctions and decapitate the leadership, and then it'll work. The unplanned entrant into the field of dialogue here was the victory by President Moon in South Korea with a large-scale program of how to re-engage the North. And in a sense, the South Koreans take the diplomatic road and take the diplomatic advantage of getting not only strong symbolic interaction, but they help de-escalate the rhetoric. They help put the focus on the fact that even if there's maximum pressure, we can still make all kinds of inroads to decide we're on the road to denuclearization and peace. And I think where we are right now, especially with coming on board of Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Bolton, we're in an internal discussion between those hardliners on North Korea and other factions in the U.S. government and people like me on the outside who believe it's time to get deeper into the weeds of this. And if you want denuclearization, there's certain other things in which you have to play the sanctions game. I'll talk about that in a minute, as in right now. What should we do if Lopez had Mr. Bolton's position or among Pompeo's? Build on the inter-Korean gains, set new meetings with more specific goals of attainment, from a signing of a real peace treaty to the opening of the industrial shared zone between North and South in Quezon, to a de-escalation of forces on both sides of the border. Secondly, and I feel for the administration in this regard, too many critics of the Trump administration are criticizing them for a naivete about those tricking North Koreans are going to have their way, and they're going to back out of an agreement in the same way that they did on Clinton in '94, the same way they did on George Bush in 2002. They can't be trusted. My advice would be the administration, let bygones be bygones, because this guy isn't his father or his grandfather. He's a whole new model, and he's not bound by that history. Don't let your fears about repeating that history constrain the creativity that you want to bring to this. It's not about those times anymore. It's about 2018 and going forward. Work on having a new structured security relationship where, like them or not, the North Korean regime for now has to be assured it will survive, because that's the basic reason for them having the weapons. Expect, as you're dealing with these guys, you're going to get 2 steps forward and you're always going to get 1 step back. Be careful that maximum pressure will produce all the things you think it will, because an escalatory cycle is much more important. And you better develop a substantial peace-building scheme in order to get there through times like we saw today when Mr. Pompeo is supposed to meet his counterpart, and mysteriously it's announced from the State Department at 11 a.m. yesterday, the meeting is not going to take place because of conflicts of schedules. Meaning that when the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister wrote it on their schedule a month ago, something came up. Hi, I really wanted to try to get there, but it looks like it's not going to work for me today. Let's do it in a month. That's not a way a regularized system of diplomatic de-escalation works. And we've got to figure out a way to make that work better through self-discipline and a better scheme. What would Lopez say is the better scheme? Well, there's one that was developed 50 years ago, very influential in U.S. policy. The Graduated Reciprocation Intention Reduction, the GRIT system. The GRIT system is a classic social psychology device where parties that are distrusting each other through lots of bad experiences but have to work on bargaining out a set of difficulties can engage in a 10 or 12 or 14-point program in which I say, I tell you what, I'm going to withdraw our participation on the U.S. side from the October exercises that you feel very much threaten you when we run them for the South Koreans. I'm doing that as an act of trust in the process. I didn't say I trusted you. I'm trusting the process. And here's what I would see as a good reciprocation on your part. You would permit a cadre of U.S. nuclear experts to examine what's going on in Pyongyang with regard to your archived records about the nuclear system, or what's going on in Yongbyon with the launch systems. And once we have the assurances that those are shut down, I'm going to go to step 2. I think we should establish offices of goodwill as a precursor to embassies in each side. Or I decide that I'm going to allow 15% increase in your coal exports that were shut down by sanctions. Now what will you do? And so it's a quid pro quo, exchange for exchange, with the bottom line being we get denuclearization by step 14, they get a full lifting of all sanctions. But unless you have that plan or something like it, we can't pull this off from the top-down strategy of summit to leap from summit to leap from summit. That's my editorial comment. Great history to this. This is what changed Kennedy's mind before the American University speech in 1963 and what led to the partial test ban with the Soviets before both of us went on a spree of testing at least 12 new nuclear weapons each in the atmosphere. Now, what about sanctions on Iran? I want to make sure I don't run out of my allotted time, so there's a long history here. The history goes back to 2006 as well, in which the Permanent Five in the Security Council began to increasingly impose sanctions based on our intelligence, our reports, and our understanding of the rhetoric of the Iranians that they were going to build a nuclear weapon. There was some skepticism and division within intelligence communities about how close they were. Sometimes you could read in the Washington Post or New York Times, they're within 18 months. Some of the rest of us believe they were not closer than 5 or 6 years in terms of a deliverable system and a sustainable reactor program. But it led, as you know, to what was called the Iranian deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, in the summer of 2015, ratified by the Security Council. Many of us believed with the continued inspections of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, showing again that the Fordo reactor had imploded and that this was going on in this place and this other place, with that largest inspection regime that we've had of another country, that this worked. But President Trump won the election. Elections matter. He believed that part of his goal and part of what contributed to his victory was that he would say that the Iran deal is one of the worst deals ever because it didn't change all these other areas of Iranian behavior that threaten our security. And he was going to ditch the Iran deal in terms of punishing the Iranians for all their bad actions in the other area. Maximum pressure sanctions again. Let's reimpose what was there before Obama signed the plan of action, and let's double down on certain areas, like the new 300 entities that are named in a number of banks 2 days ago. But these Europeans like the deal, so we better go one step further. Any European company that deals with Iran, we're going to deny them access to the U.S. market. Secondary sanctions are, in the diplomatic era, the most impolite sanctions you can impose on someone. That's before we get to the economic dimensions of them, okay? So if you want to know what diplomatically really irritated our European partners, besides a number of other confrontations with Trump, the notion that you were now intruding on their economy when they believed an agreement they signed in international law should be upheld. You're penalizing them for upholding international law because you wanted to withdraw from it. None of us in this room can agree that they're right, but that is the way the Europeans felt, which led to some of these difficulties. Mr. Trump feels very, very strongly about an alliance with Israel and Saudi Arabia, who are the two strongest opponents in the region of Iran. And his conscious appointment of Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, who have believed in going to war with Iran, significantly sent a message to the Iranians about where this is going. So we have an end to the Iran deal in phase 1 in May, and the completion of that this week. Secondary sanctions on friends, and also some tariffs on friends. In June, Mr. Pompeo lays out 12 points that the Iranians must agree to in order for sanctions to ever be lifted. There's never been a sanctions case in which there have been more than 6 points in which you expect another side to adjust their behavior. And there's a message there. Do you want the sanctions to succeed or not based on what we know from the history of past sanctions? Now, more publicly, after the points and the end of the deal have been made, you can find multiple examples of Mr. Bolton and particularly Mr. Pompeo saying the real goal of these sanctions is to change the regime in Iran. And some of us are old enough in this room to have heard regime change before as a foreign policy goal. Is there a coming war with Iran? Here's the scenarios that may play out. The theories that link sanctions, diplomacy, and the possibility of war. Theory 1, hey, Mr. Trump has been able to pull it off with North Korea. The maximum pressure has led to summits. We're not nearly as nervous about the outbreak of nuclear war as we were a year ago at this time. It's all working, and it'll work with Iran. Give it patience. Theory 2, U.S. and Iran hostility about these sanctions will continue to escalate rhetorically, but then in Syria, either on purpose or by accident, U.S. and Iranian-backed forces engage in some hostilities. There's a big incident or two, and the United States feels that we're about to need to strike directly to Iran because the forces that they supported attacked Americans in Syria. Theory 3, it's not going to be by accident that way. In fact, fighting breaks out between one of our strategic allies, Saudi Arabia or Israel, with Iran, and because of alliance commitments, we're drawn into a direct war with Iran. Or theory 4, as I think seems to be playing out, Iran takes none of this bait whatsoever. It continues to live according to the JCPOA. It's trying to work things out in Europe, but it's not going to change its behavior in certain other areas that the U.S. objects to, while the U.S. is saying its purpose is to overthrow the regime. And theory 5, the U.S. provides or finds a mechanism whereby there's something that happens internally in Iran that leads us to engage in a kind of humanitarian intervention to overthrow the regime, looking an awful lot like March 2003, for those of us in the room who are old enough to remember that. Unfortunately, with number 5, there's no theory or case in history that supports that sanctions are ever successful in and of themselves with bringing down a regime. You can damage them, you can arm twist them, you can bargain with them, but you never bring them down. So, my advice for U.S. policy towards Iran, we better start a broader national dialogue than the one that occurs between 7 individuals in the National Security Council and the White House with regard to where do we want policy with Iran to go. Because it's inextricably linked to difficulties with Saudi Arabia, the future of our relationship with Israel, and with our partners from Europe. We've got to use more evidence-based indicators for what Iran is really doing. Mr. Trump abrogated a deal saying it was the worst deal and never told us where the Iranians violated it, because they never did. The strongest objection to the deal was, Well, 10 years from now, they have the right to produce these nuclear isotopes again. Tell me a public policy in the domestic or international sector where we reject it at time t because at time t plus 10, something might happen. It's just impossible logic from my point of view. We better reverse the punishment and isolation strategy. We got to find a way to talk to the Iranians under almost any conditions. And don't repeat the mistakes that we look like we're repeating from 2002 to 2003 when we were told certain things about how easy an intervention in another country would be. Thank you for your patience. I look forward to greater dialogue.
My first question is, leaders of other nations, specifically in Europe, have condemned the actions of the Trump administration to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. Will these other nations be able to take steps to minimize the impact of the new U.S. sanctions without becoming a target of Trump?
Good question. We've got to separate here the nation as a target versus the entities that do business with Iran. The goal of the secondary sanctions is to constrain the businesses that do work in Iran from doing that work at the cost of not being able to do similar work in the United States. So let's say you're a textile importer-exporter in France, and you had an emerging set of affiliate factories you were dealing with in Iran, really liked the idea there's going to be a lot more Persian rugs on the market. It was a win-win for your business, their local business. You're starting to sell those things all over. But you also own major carpet-producing companies in the United States. The United States business is $12 billion a year. The business with Iran is $1 billion a year. What are you going to keep? You're going to keep the business in the United States, and you're going to close out Iran. So the constraints on businesses are real. The constraints on the states are that the states, which have signed an agreement with Iran that we're now opening up economic exchange, now look like they're not strong enough to protect the economic exchange between the Iranian business people and the French business people. And a government doesn't want to look that way, especially when none of it is through their doing and the other side hasn't committed an offense. So that's what leads to strained relationships. It leads to even more strained relationships when you decide you're going to tariff certain things from certain of the countries that you're now constraining the businesses of in secondary sanctions. And it leads to even crazier things when you do what you did on Tuesday, which is after saying we're going to stop the flow of Iranian oil forever by the end of this calendar year, as Mr. Pompeo said multiple times, and then the State Department says we're going to give some exemptions. And you list 7 nations that have exemptions. And some of those nations are not the nations like Belgium, France, and UK, which sent a special petition to Washington over a month ago that the following firms be exempt at least for 6 months while they made a transition. Not in oil, but in regular goods. And the White House hasn't answered that to our deepest friends. So yeah, this is very costly in very serious ways.
Will this type of impact, these new sanctions, cause other problems with international relations between us and our allies?
This is the President of the United States since Truman who's been invited to the least foreign capitals to visit. So if you take as an indication how anxious and hopeful are nations that they could entertain the President and an entourage to have shared talks of shared interests as an indication of the quality of diplomatic relations, this is costly.
One last question, and then we'll get to the audience questions. Since President Trump has become president, North Korea has reduced its combative posturing by reducing its testing and removing the weapons from its annual parade. Is this a sign that Trump has been more successful than past administrations, or is it just a show per se?
I don't see any reason why it can't be both, and I'm delighted in both. Shows symbolic attainments of goals that link to de-escalation of rhetoric, that link to possibility of successive policy. All of that works for most of us most of the time, which is why I think I mentioned I don't agree with folks who are saying you're being had, don't trust them, etc. No, let's march forward in the new successes. But the problem is there's no plan for getting to those successes. So the North Koreans say, what are you going to deliver to us, Mr. Pompeo, at this meeting on Thursday? We have 4 things on the table. We'd like a signing of a peace treaty, or we'd like the reduction of sanctions, or we'd like to make sure that if we agree with the South Koreans, we open up industrial exchanges, and you don't rule that out by putting tariffs on the South Korean goods. And which one do you want to agree to? And our response is, we want complete and verifiable and immediate denuclearization. So there is success in the fact that we have the dialogue. There is success that the proposals are on the table. What there's not is a map for how to put them together and how to understand that you've got to dig in for anywhere from 3 to 5 years of trial and error and small concession and concession and concession, and you can win this thing. You can win this thing. You can't win it without opening a diplomatic office in North Korea. You can't win it without having a bevy of bureaucrats who know nuclear materials, who know North Korea, and who know economic developments in North Korea as a huge entourage following Mr. Pompeo. We can't run it with 3 people deciding they'll decide how they'll bargain with North Korea. I got in a lot of trouble, as I told a couple of you at the thing before we began, when I had some State Department people to my left at a big conference in Canada and Canadian ministers to the right, and someone said, how excited are you? What makes you think about success or nervousness about the Korean bargaining? And I said, the first time we do a serious negotiation, there's going to be 27 North Koreans, each with discrete expertise in how to do denuclearization and improve economic relations. And there's going to be Trump, Pompeo, Bolton, 2 or 3 other people, Susan Thornton, who's still the acting temporary undersecretary for Eastern Affairs in the State Department, and nobody else. Maybe Mr. Mattis. We don't not only fail to have a bench for dealing one-on-one with Korean experts, we don't have a starting lineup. So I don't know how you make this work unless you're intentional, clear, and move it beyond what can be shown at the press conference and put bureaucrats together for weeks at a time to figure out what you're going to exchange for what and get to that 14-point system. I'm sorry to be so partisan on this because I don't consider it partisan. I consider that this is what American national security is on the verge of attaining if we're only capable enough of doing it.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn it over to the audience.
I don't think your comments are partisan at all, and I strongly agree with what you're saying. John Bolton was the guy who was behind the Iraqi fiasco, one of the drivers of that, as I recall. I'm old enough to remember that. And the Iraqi occupation by the United States was what reinforced the hardliners in Iran in their 2004 election, where they elected Ahmadinejad rather than a Green candidate. So we've helped create that problem by taking over Iraq. My opinion is that a guy named Netanyahu is the guy that's afraid of the Iranian nuclear weapon, and candidate Trump listened to him more than anybody else and they'd ignored the fact that they destroyed that reactor that made plutonium. They had a big stock of plutonium. We knew how to make a plutonium bomb 70 years ago, and we did it without testing. It worked. Iran could have built a nuclear weapon and have them today if they had not signed that 2015 agreement, and we'd be in really deep doo-doo. So I encourage you to strongly keep going, because my opinion is that by withdrawing from the Iran deal, we've basically told the world you can't trust the United States anymore to live up to its obligations, and that is an extremely dangerous path that we've taken. So keep up the good work.
Well, I'll go back to 2 dimensions of how to make this work. One is you make the set of demands at its best in straight diplomatic dialogue across the table. Here's what we're having trouble with here. Here's what you've got to stop here. Here's what we want you to do here. Here's the timeline. And secondly, what's the quid pro quo? Because we already have sanctions on them about this. We've added new sanctions that have nothing to do with terrorism to bring down the rest of the economy in the name of saying it'll affect their behavior on terrorism. I don't make that link, so I would make a different link, which is, here's the stick, here's the carrots. Help us deal with the Russians to get you both out of Syria. Or secondly, help us de-escalate Hezbollah, because you know, and the Iranians do know, and we know that the dilemma in Lebanon is going to be when all those Hezbollah folks who have the taste of blood on their hands come back to Lebanon, and they're not going to go back to the marketplace and the barracks quietly. So the Iranians and the Lebanese have a shared security problem on their hands once the Hezbollah fighters come home. So how do we demobilize, defang Hezbollah, which will be in Iran's medium to long-term interest, not their short-term one right now when they're the proxies fighting in Syria? Solve Syria, keep the agreement, and march on, and have a plan. Is it okay for this to take 3 years? Probably. Will Mr. Netanyahu feel real good about us sitting down with the Iranians? Absolutely not. And please don't get me wrong. I love Israel. I've had lots of Israeli students. I have tons of Israeli colleagues. But if you love Israel, this Iranian policy is a bad policy for us and for Israel. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you for this format. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.